This is Daily Boy back here again. And this week we starting a new series which is going to be focusing on video testimonies, and I'm going to share my own personal testimony long format with you guys. So, hang with me while we get to that. I grew up in Guyana, and I was born in the late 80s. And so Guyana was a very rural, sort of a more rural place than it is now at that time, especially in the neighborhood that I was from. Although I wasn't really particularly born in a rural area in Guyana, uh, my neighborhood at that time was still sort of like developing technology wise and whatnot. And so my lifestyle uh was very kind of, it was very cool actually growing up. I sort of grew up on like a farm land type of thing. And so uh my experience was just kind of like hunting and fishing and making crafts and that type of thing. And uh the neighborhood that we were in, all the neighbors, we sort of all kind of shared the land that we lived on, if you will. Although we had our own houses, it was kind of like a big terrain for a kid to sort of explore and kind of, you know, sort of live and make great memories. And it's, I think I probably consider myself fortunate to have grown up in the situation that I did. Um, the perspective that I had from being somebody who grew up uh, in this sort of rural area is was pretty epic. Um, I had a particularly fun childhood, right? We had like multiple ponds in our yards, and so fishing and that type of stuff, and we had all types of animals, both like wild animals that lived on the terrain that were running around that we would hunt and try to catch and things like that. We had like domesticated animals. Of course we had chickens, and there was some cows when I was younger, and we had pigs all through my life growing up, and you know ducks and that type of stuff, but also pets. And not only just the regular pets, I had a lot of dogs and that type of thing, but I also had um some exotic pets as well, like snakes and monkeys and things like that. And it was a pretty epic childhood, I would say. My family were very Christian, and Jesus was at the center of our life. We were, I was like a pastor's kid, although my dad wasn't the pastor of a lot of the churches that we went to for the majority of my childhood. But um, I was fortunate enough to have a whole host of family members that would sit around, and they would just kind of tell these stories. And they were primarily telling ghost stories, essentially. And we call it Jumbi stories in Guyana. And so these stories were a critical part of my life. Uh, I remember just kind of like sitting around and just listening to them, and they would just go on these long sort of rants about, I mean, they would start to talk about all types of stuff, but eventually they would get into the paraphernalia world and talk about their own experiences with with all of these unexplainable situations that they had, and they were convinced that these were demonic encounters. My family, they were Hindus for the for like the first part of their life. Of course, a lot of Indo-Guyanese people would be coming from a Indian background, and they would have came over to Guyana with Hinduism as their religion for the most parts, right? And so they had all these crazy experiences, and they would sit around and they would just talk about these things. And being that these were people that were close to me, right? These were family members of mine. And this was my, like, grandmother, grandfather, uncles, aunties, and these type of things. I trusted them, and so I would listen to the stories, and I knew that they weren't making this up. If it was somebody sort of like spinning a yarn somewhere on TV or something like that, I would probably lean towards the fact that maybe they're making this up, maybe they have some sort of ulterior motives, but they weren't even really talking to me or telling me these stories. I was just in the presence of them recounting these stories between themselves. And so sometimes I would hear the stories from one person's perspective, and then I would hear the story from another person's perspective. And sometimes I would hear a story from somebody, and you know uh someone else that wasn't there when that person is telling the story would come in. Maybe have an auntie that lives in the states or something like that, and they would come in, and then they would tell that story from their own perspective, and it became very clear. It became something that was very, like, I was convinced, let's put it this way, right? I was convinced that the paraphernalia stuff was real. uh I also, like, at some point we got a TV in Guyana, and at this time it was very strange. Like, it wasn't normal for people to have TVs. It was just like TVs were now starting to bud, and especially, certain classes of family didn't couldn't afford them, and finally we ended up getting one. And I remember as a kid looking at all these docu series, like documentaries, and most notably, they would have these sort of ones about the paranormal activities documentaries, and I would watch those, and they would be eerily similar to what my family was talking about as well. And there was the alien documentaries as well, that I would also sort of like indulge in, if you will. And it was very eerily similar, the experiences that people were explaining that they had with the encounters and the room shifting and all this type of stuff that they would talk about, the presence that they would feel in the room, the weight, the temperature shifting in the room as they were experiencing these things. And some of the details of the experience that they would recount kind of also worked towards convincing me. I started seeing similarities, even the historical the things about, where you watch these things about, the pyramids and all this type of stuff, and how they were built, and you look at all these cave drawings and these type of things, the archaeological finds that they would have. I remember this one time they were talking about mermaids, and they were talking about, like, all these different cave drawings from all over the place, and all these archaeological facts or artifacts that they would find that have these similar stories about these creatures. And they were baffled at the fact that these ancient civilizations that were really very disjointed at that time would have these sort of similar stories and encounters. And so I started sort of putting this all together, right? And I believed in the supernatural. I believed in the fact that there was something out there that was outside of what we understand currently as the physical realm. And later off, you know, listening to these stories, I also knew that there was m- what's the word, malevolent beings that existed, right? And there was beings that would sort of torture people, if you will, or try to harm people, or just were scary in general, right? And a lot of the encounters that my family was recounting was something like that, right? There was some stories that I listened to as a child, that, you know they could be interpreted in many different ways. I'll give you like a couple of these type of stories, right? So one time my grandfather was telling me, let me set up a bit. My grandfather was telling me a story of my grandmother. He tells this story a lot, actually, kind of often. And she went to the movie theaters that was near our house at the time, and he was across the street. I think he went across the street and he looked over and he saw her and she was in the house, and he was kind of baffled. He knew she left to go to the movie, and she has a way that she kind of leans over. She's like scratching her back the way that she normally does, and I actually know exactly what he's talking about. I think a lot of my family members would know what he was referring to. And so he tried to kind of call for her and she wouldn't answer him. And he kind of found it strange. So he came over to the house and he went upstairs. And then he recounts walking and she walks past him. She goes into the room and he's kind of like trying to get her attention, trying to like talk to her. And she kind of just ignores him, passes him. And then he felt that there was something strange about the experience. And then later, he looked down the street and she was coming back from the movie theater. So he was convinced that this was sort of a demonic encounter that he was having. And then there's another story of the same grandfather. And I mean, there's lots of other stories. I don't know. I'm telling you all of his stories, but uh, there was not all of it, but just some of it, anyways. I'm using his stories as examples. There's another time he was in what we call like a center ground. It's kind of like sort of like the area that we would use. It's like a big field that we would use for sports and whatnot in Guyana. And he was in this ground flying a kite, and he must have been a kid at this time, and there was this roller, and he was like, a roller is something we play a game called cricket. Many of you guys are familiar with it. It's a cricket thing, right? And so like it's used to flatten out the cricket pitch. And so he's like sitting there, he's leaning on this thing, and he starts to hear music coming from inside of this thing. And so he pressed his ears up against it, and he could hear like sort of an entire band playing music. And we call it tasa music, and like a wedding house is what he describes as what he was hearing, right? And so a wedding house is type of music, especially when he was a kid. This must have been like, I don't know, I would say 70, 80 years ago in Guyana. It's very strange that, it's not like they had some sort of device that someone could have been playing tricks on him with. But however, he heard this sound about 3 or 4 times, and then he decided to sort of, slowly take his kite down and flee from there. There's another situation where he saw this monkey, and the monkey was sitting on a bridge, and it's just kind of like sitting at this impasse, and it was like just staring into the distance, like very still, unnaturally anyways, right? And he kind of tries to fake at it and it wouldn't move, and he eventually goes on his way, and then he's passing back, I think well later in that day, and that thing is in the exact same position, the exact same way. And so he is he's kind of like wondering what's happening. He tries to fake at it again, and he realizes something is off about this situation. And so he gets very spooked out, and he decides, he kind of apologizes and leaves, right? Because at this point he's not a Christian or anything like that. But he gets a bit scared and he decides it's time to get out of there. And so these are stories that somebody could venture to sort of explain. I mean, you can understand how maybe someone could say, well, your grandmother probably snuck back into the house and and then she snuck out or something like that. I could picture like having explanations to that. I can picture something about that monkey is off. It's strange, right? Like maybe it took some sort of drugs. I could picture people having all types of explanation. Maybe it was like having some sort of like, I don't know, paralysis or something. Like it was in a state of like whatever, and it was just there. And stranger things have happened that has natural explanations to it, but then the stories range into things that are unexplainable, like people getting like physically picked up and like thrown onto the ground by nothing, or beaten up, like physically beaten up by like demons, where there's no person around that can that you can explain this phenomena of people getting slapped out of like trees that they're climbing when they're stealing something or something like that. And the stories get really, really wild at some point. There's like uh stories of basically, and sometimes we're ashamed to really share these type of things, but these are things that are out there and exist. There's like stories of what we would call like a vampire, right? And I've heard stories of like my brother getting attacked or sucked by one of these things. It's like in Guyana we call it a olag, right? And I know some people are gonna be like, oh no, that's just a myth or whatever. And I've heard these stories from so many Guyanese people, and my family has witnessed this thing as like as a true thing. Like my brother has gotten attacked by it, my dad has gotten attacked by it, and a lot of other family members as well. And we go to different places, and people talk about these stories of this thing attacking them. And then you look across the board and you start figuring out a lot of cultures have these ideas of vampires and things like that, and there's other explanations given for them. But when you see somebody like actually like at someone's neck, like, and there's multiple people there and whatnot, and you witness this as like an attack, and this thing flees or whatever, right? And when people are seeing this type of stuff, you know and recounting these stories, it becomes a little bit harder to brush away. It becomes a little bit harder for me personally. I was very convinced, um so I was convinced that there was a supernatural realm. Being a kid growing up in church as well, I've seen other things that also helped to convince me of the reality of the supernatural world, right? And uh I witnessed miracles as well. Like, our pastor at the time, uh I'm not gonna say his name, would kind of run across the stage and put his hand out, and people would fall like all through the service. And at this time we were a small community, we knew everyone there. This is not some kind of magic trick or something that he's doing. And uh this is happening, right? This is actually happening to people. There's people being that are demon possessed. And like one of my boys told me this story of a person dropping to the floor and her body becoming like a snake and slithering under the church benches all the way up to the front of the church. I've heard this story. I've actually heard this one multiple times of people. This demon that's basically pitch, positioned himself and he's known as he a stink breath. And when this person said that name, like when the person said, my name is Stink Breath, like the whole church being filled with like this odor, like in that church. And and so we've seen people like being delivered from demonic possessions. We've seen the power that was in the name of Jesus. So, I mean, even healings and things like that. And so it became very apparent to me that Jesus was like positioned in this position of authority over the spiritual realm. His name seemed to carry a lot of weight. So I was convinced that Jesus is also God. I was convinced that he was sort of the pinnacle of this spiritual realm, right? It seemed like he kind of was the boss, like he controlled everything in a sense, right? And it seemed like, you know, uh there was uh benevolent beings as well. Aside from the benevolent beings, you could tell that there's sort of a tug of war. There's like evil spirits, and then there's like good spirits, if you will, right? And so uh even as a kid, just being around the atmosphere of worship a lot, when I did find myself sort of focusing, not something that I did all the time as a kid in church, but when I did find myself sort of focusing and locking in to whatever was going on, I would feel this sort of malevolent presence. I would feel some sort of like, and people would explain this as just like, a product of of sort of like a mental thing that's happening. It's mental stimulant, because there's people who describe sort of similar feelings at, like, I don't know, a secular concert or at these other places. But I was convinced that these worlds did exist and this stuff was real through those experiences, right? uh at an age of about, I don't know, about 9 years old, and even prior to 9 years old, I found that I was actually maybe more prone to being someone who was a lustful individual from since I was young, because I always had this sense of like women, and like, this idea of like, I didn't know fully what it was, but I had this sort of lust type of thing in me, right? And I think about 9 years old is when I finally got introduced to sort of like pornography and things like that. At a certain age, just before high school in Guyana, we would call it I think primary and secondary. Just before going to secondary school, more people in and around my classroom, they were starting, just naturally, of course, right? They were starting to get more open about the fact that girls and guys, that type of stuff, like that guys like girls and things like that. And so we were getting a little bit more open with the thing. Before that, we were ashamed. We were like, we didn't want to say. Coming into high school, I sort of became a little bit more. All became more about girls and open and whatnot. And when I first started, sort of indulging in this sort of lustful situation, it was kind of shameful. Like, I started knowing about masturbation and this type of thing, and indulging in that and practicing that from since I was about 9 years old. And it was a super shameful thing. But as I kept doing this type of stuff, it became something that was more open and more part of my life. And I became a very promiscuous person. Uh, at some point, I remember having these sort of dreams, right? And one of the dreams, these dreams occurred before I even understood what a dream was, because I was so young at the time that, like, I didn't even know the difference, right? So this is sort of way back. And it's only later off in my walk is when I started remembering these things. Well, I always remember the dreams, but I never really connected some of these things. So I'm hoping this sort of connects throughout the testimony, anyways, right? And so I started I had this one reoccurring dream where there was these women, and I recall they were white women. They were dressed in bikinis and those type of outfits, and they were very beautiful. They were standing along a along, well, I knew what was behind them because this was a recurring dream, but there was a well that was behind them. Now, you couldn't see the well. They were just kind of lined up in front of the well, and they were just like calling to me, right? And it was like, I remember, because I had this dream so many times, it kept reoccurring. It was like I was outside of my body, and I was looking at myself going towards these women, and I was trying to warn myself. I'm just saying, hey man, don't go, no, don't go. You know what's gonna this is gonna happen. And it's like myself outside of myself is not listening. Myself, that's sort of me. I'm not listening to this other self outside of myself, and I'm just auto walking towards them, right? And it's like I can't stop. And then finally, when I get close enough, these women would like their face would transform, their teeth turns into these like like I don't know, like sharp pointy things, and their face turns demonic. By then it's too late, I'm too close. They kind of grab me and they move away, and then the well is behind them. They throw me into this well, and I would fall and fall and fall until I woke up. That was one of the dreams. I mean, there was some other weird dreams that I had. I'm not sure if it's worth mentioning in this video. There was I'm not sure it's related anyways, right? But there was this one dream where I used to have monkeys as pets. I had like you know quite a few different type, like we had parrots and all that type of stuff. And every time a monkey dies from us, back in those days we had these garbage piles. We used to like throw the monkeys into the garbage piles and burn the garbage piles and burn the monkey in that garbage pile. And I don't this is the thing, is like I was so young at the time that in my mind, when I remember these things, I didn't think they were dreams. I thought they actually happened, right? So that fire with that monkey, the dead monkey burning in it, would like the fire would be like over our house. Later off, when I really started thinking about it, even growing up, like as I was thinking about some of these memories and these dreams, I'm like, that couldn't have happened. That must have been a dream. Uh, but there was some pretty eerie, freaky things about these dreams in particular, especially the one with the females, because at that time I wouldn't have known what a white woman looked like, or like bikinis or anything like that. There was no way for me to have had that experience, or to it's kind of like I seen this before. It was something that was a reality for me. And so, fast forward, uh I spent maybe the first I was like being younger, I was sort of an academic kid, but as I got older, I started like losing focus, and I wasn't like really the best student. And so I got sent to this school. Before I say that, actually, I should say that like I had this one time where I had this prayer where I was talking to God, and I remember telling God that like I wanted to go and experience this life of sort of like becoming a gangster and doing all of this crazy stuff, and you know what I mean, and have this experience of living a worldly lifestyle. And in a prayer to him, I was sitting on my we call it's like a balcony, we call it a veranda. And I was sitting on this veranda, I was looking up at the stars in the sky. I was talking to God, and I was telling him, and I've always had a relationship with God where even as a kid, growing up. And so like I remember having this prayer where I talked to him and I told him I wanted to do this. And this is something also that I forgot. And maybe, years later, as things started to manifest, it came back to my recollection as maybe that has something to do with what entirely happened to me. But uh I we have this thing called common entrance in Guyana. It's sort of like a test, like a preliminary test, and it lets you know what high school you qualify for. And so people that do well, they go to the best schools with the brightest individuals. And so I got into the worst school, right? At that time, it was a school called Potentia in Guyana. And so Potentia was like the lowest school. It was the least desirable school you wanted to go to. And obviously, all of the kids that weren't doing that well were going to this same school. And so What happened though is the year that I was supposed to go to Potentia had burnt down. It completely, like, there was a fire, completely burnt down. And so all of the students from Potentia had to go to a nearby school, another sort of like not so reputable school called Wales Secondary School. And it was sort of like inside of a market. And there was just way too many students in that school. It was well overran, and so the students ran the school. I remember they brought in this one uh very strict headmistress. She had like a thing that she like beat people with, and it was like she called it Blackie, and she was very proud, and she was very strict, very boisterous, and they tried to bring her in to sort of get control of the school, but it was just wild. That school was just wild. There wasn't that much going on there. The teachers couldn't really control anything. I think even some of the teachers, like probably a lot of teachers probably quit because a lot of the teachers that we had were just like younger, new people, and they didn't seem to know what they were doing either. And it was nuts there. And so that school became like, you know, uh it was a school filled with like sort of like thugs and gangsters. And I, in order to survive there, like you kind of had to become sort of tough as well. And so we had like a little gang that we formulated. And, looking back on it, it's kind of like I started becoming sort of like this started shaping me into a person that, you know, ultimately transgressed into who I became later in life. And so we ended up, me and my family, we ended up moving from Guyana and coming to Canada. And being in Canada, my parents, although they were very busy, uh, even when we were in Guyana, they were always home. We ran a business. My parents were pretty reputable individuals. Like they were sort of highly regarded in our community. My dad being a pastor and a successful businessman. But even though they were busy, our business was in our home. So my dad and my mom was always there. Coming to Canada, however, things changed and they were very busy. Now they were out of the house. They were working at factories and things like that, trying to provide for me and my brother. Only one of my brothers came with us from Guyana. The government at the embassy at the time decided not to give a visa to one of my brothers so that we could go back to Guyana. And so we came and we started my parents were kind of trying to stay in Canada. They started applying under different grounds and they started working. They got like a work permit. They were able to work in factories and these type of things. And they started working almost instantly and they were working extremely long hours and weird hours. And so they were hardly home. So me and my brother, our house was kind of empty and it became this free for all house. I'm not sure how much they know about this, but we used to have all types of people over, girls, this, that. There was all kinds of stuff starting to manifest from there on. These things led me into more and more deep into, my own sort of like uh just being a person who was just about that whole, you know, sort of like gangster type mentality. We were starting to drink a lot. We were starting to smoke. We were smoking a lot of weed at that time. We started becoming people that were uh you know sort of promiscuous with women and that type of thing. And ultimately I ended up moving out of my house and I ended up getting a house with two girls who are both, in fact, one of them is my daughter's mom and my ex-wife at this point now. And so we ended up getting married uh at a point where I was getting sent back to Guyana. We ultimately didn't get our papers and we had to move back to Guyana. And so this one girl that was with me at that time decided she was gonna marry me so that I could stay ultimately. And we did get married for real. We didn't like do it just for papers. The timing of it was for the papers, but you know, we decided to go ahead and do this thing for real. So I got married very young. I was about 20 at the time, and then I ended up moving back to Guyana, where Guyana was a little bit more humble. When I got back there, I settled down a bit. Uh, I didn't smoke nearly as much, but I was still a drinker, partier, and that type of thing. Because I was married, I wasn't as into women. Maybe just the pornography and things like that was still there, of course, but like I wasn't trying to play around with other women and things like that. But so it was a bit of a like a humbling experience. I spent about 3 years in Guyana, and leaving Canada at 20 years old, I had already built sort of a life for myself in Canada at the time. Going back to Guyana, I started over from scratch. I had developed gambling habits and things like that. And I ultimately, days before going back to Guyana, I gambled out like almost my entire whatever. I didn't have much savings anyways, but I gambled out whatever I had at that time. And so going back to Guyana, I had like $500 on me. I went to this car show one day, and I had the money on me and I got robbed for the money. I was trying to play this game in Guyana called Chick Chick Board. I really wasn't trying to play the game. I was trying to change the money, like acting like I'm gonna play the game, and then that way I could buy drinks because my cousin was sporting me at the time, and I wanted to sort of pay for stuff, and I got robbed for that too. So I ended up getting these video games shipped into Guyana, and I built like a video game arcade. And about 3 years into being in Guyana, I ended up building a life there as well. I ended up having sort of a thriving business. I was doing very well, and I ended up getting my papers to come back to Canada. Now, I moved back to Guyana with my parents. And so, even though I was a bit wild, I was still governed in a sense. But coming back to Canada, I came back without my parents, right? And so I ended up sort of now living a life where, before I was like, I was still starting to smoke cigarettes and things like that. It took me a while to start smoking cigarettes into my lifestyle, but ultimately I would still hide it a little bit. But coming back to Canada now, my parents wasn't around. I didn't have to hide. I was just open with my thing, and I just kept progressing down this track, and when you become a person who has all of these sort of characteristics about you and interests, you develop friendships with a lot of people also that have those type of interests. And so I had a group of friends that were here in Canada that were extremely happy to see me come back. And I went into that circle again. And of course, like I love my friends and they're cool. But at the same time, the lifestyle that we were living was, not ideal to say the least. And, it's kind of crazy because that lifestyle is so prevalent now that it's not actually that crazy to some people, right? And it's actually very normal, right? Like the whole partying, drinking, going to clubs, popping bottles, taking girls home, this, that. Like that's just a regular lifestyle for a lot of people. So I started getting into hard drugs at some point, and my life became very like just uh just party focused. I would handle my business to a degree outside of partying, but I wasn't worried about a lot of things. Like everything was like expiring. I didn't know nothing about no paperwork, nothing like that. Passports, everything was just like, all I cared about was making money and getting to party on the weekends and getting to party throughout the week even sometimes. And so my lifestyle became very debaucherous, to say the least. And it got to the point where like I was so promiscuous, and um I was so into like when you live that lifestyle, it's kind of like the more freaky things, the more taboo something is, the more exciting it is for you. And so, I got into this space where, I started like destroying friendships, destroying family relationships. Ultimately, I ended up like not only doing hard drugs, but I ended up even starting to become a drug dealer and like selling drugs to be able to be on drugs. I ended up becoming having girls around me that was like, and people were on like all kinds of hard drugs. There's people doing crack and all types of things, like, and women were prostitutes around me. I ended up sort of working with prostitutes in the sense of like, you know uh being around them and like, sort of benefiting from that situation. Like, basically ended up like in a situation where I was like a pimp in that way, right? Although it was like a friendship, a mutual relationship, and I was just there, but I was earning money from being there. And so um I ultimately ended up even becoming homeless at one point. This descended into the point where I was living in my car, and at that time I had like an old van, and it was like it was leaky, like there's air, like it wasn't like air sealed, and it would be cold in Canada. So I would have on a couple of jackets sometimes just to be in there to sleep. I would even go to the liquor store and steal liquor from the liquor store just to get drunk enough so that I could pass out in my truck, in my van at the time. And so, like, these were short periods of time that I was homeless, but it descended to that point. I started becoming unhealthy as well. I was gaining weight at a certain point, and I was developing knee pains. I was developing back pains. I was having like, the shorty that I was with at this time, like that was like the main shorty that kind of held me down. She was kind of swerving on me, and like it was getting bad. My whole life was starting to fall apart. And I would still I'm it's probably a key point to mention that I would be driving home and I would be so drunk and like so high and whatever I was on and whatnot. And every time I jumped behind the wheel to try to get home, I would start praying. And my prayer was always selfish. It was like I started praying just to ask God not to get me pulled over by the police. That was my motivation to pray in any case, right? And to a degree, I still always like looked I had those experiences as a kid sort of still guiding me. So I always still saw Jesus as this that figure, that guy. And I always still like would refer to, like, me and my friends would get into debates and discussions, and I would always refer to the Bible as the ultimate authority. It was kind of weird. Even atheists and all people from other faith backgrounds and whatnot, that the Bible did carry an authority to the point where when I would mention the Bible, it was much weightier than us just having a discussion. So that was something that I always still kind of did, even though I was living this lifestyle. But this prayer would go from, Lord, please don't get me pulled over by the cops. Just help me to get home safely. And I was never worried about crashing. I was always worried about getting pulled over. But it would stem into me just talking to God and then saying, because I'm feeling convicted. Now I know I'm only going to him for this. And I'm just like, yo, fam, like, if I'm not living right, if what I'm doing is not okay, like I can't do it. And there were times where I would try to quit. and I would quit things for like a month, 2 months, 3 months sometimes, but I would always fall back in because I was still around this entire lifestyle, right? And so I would say these prayers and ask God to help me, to just take me out of this situation. I would be like, I can't do it without you. Like I've tried and I just can't do it. I don't have the strength. So I need you to help me, right? And so I have a lot of Muslim friends around me, even on to now, right? And I had this one Muslim friend, and me and him would, I would go to his shop. He had a shop at the time, and I would sit at his shop. I would kind of bother him from working because I would go there and I would ball up these big fat blunts. Like we used to, put like 2 grams. A lot of times when people tell me about how they used to drink and smoke, and things like that. Like it's kind of like, it's almost embarrassing to say how much I used to drink and smoke because someone will tell me a story and be like, yo, I used to smoke like 3 blunts a day. And it's like, whoa, fam, like we smoke like 3 blunts an hour. You know what I mean? Like them times we used to put like 2 grams of weed, ball it up into a one big fat we have this thing called backwoods, and we would chief down a whole backwood to the face, sometimes like between two of us. And then a lot of times as soon as we're done one, we ball up again and we smoke another one. Maybe 20 minutes pass, maybe someone else comes and they want to smoke, so they ball up and we keep smoking. And so I used to bother him, go to his shop, and I was there early in the morning, just pretty much getting high with my friend. And so we ended up, we had another friend that introduced us to like some Pastor David Lynn videos. And Pastor David Lynn at this time was debating a Muslim on the streets. And so it was interesting to say the least. And we had a lot of conversations about it. And so I decided, like, and so we kind of got interested. So we started watching a lot of Muslims versus Christians debating. And at this time, it was innocent. It was cool. It was me and him sitting, and we were just kind of like, whoa, fascinating. Or like, did you know this piece of information or whatever, right? And a lot of times we'd pause and we would talk about the points that were being made and, talk between ourselves and whatnot. And it was all cool. And then I remember this one time we got to this pinnacle of the discussion. We got to this point where we were like kind of talking about a lot of the similarities and differences. And we got to this point of like Islamic eschatology versus Christian eschatology. And it wasn't really that we were talking about it as like, oh, this is what your scripture teaches, or this is what my scripture teaches. It was just kind of like he was explaining Islamic eschatology, and they have a figure called the Mahdi and things like that. And the way he described the Mahdi in this like in this thing, and these three persons that are coming in the Islamic eschatology, it was like it was very similar to the Christian thing, but it was like it was reversed, right? And his Mahdi at the time, this was what he was saying about his Mahdi, very much sounded like a figure that's like an antichrist figure in our Bible, right? And I was like, whoa, we have that same, but yo, that guy's the evil guy in our thing. And it was like, you know what I mean? This moment for us was like, whoa, like what's happening here? How come our stories align to a degree, but there's like, it's like a role reverse between the characters. Now that actually sparked us into getting into actual debates and discussions, and that got more of my Muslim friends involved in the debates. And so more people started coming to me with challenging questions, to say the least, about Christianity, right? And again, these were just discussions at the time, but they would just challenge my faith, and they would ask me all the typical questions that a Muslim or someone challenging Christianity would ask. Yo, what's up with your Bible? it's been changed all this time, and there's so many copies, and there's so much there's copies of copies of copies, and there's so much variance, and like look at all the times it's been translated, and you guys don't even have the Bible today, and like what's up with Jesus? How come he said this one thing? How come there's so many contradiction? What about slavery in the Bible? What about, you know, this issue and that issue? And every time I was asked a challenging question, being that I grew up as a Christian, being that I grew up in the church, I did have some sort of an answer, but I would also go away and then kind of start researching and studying, right? And so every time I was asked these challenging questions, I would sort of go back and do more research and just, it, like I'll give you guys an example, right? One time one of my friends asked me about uh Jesus and why Jesus was saying uh he did the Eli Eli lama Shabbatani, which is like the Father Father, why have you forsaken me, right? Or my God, why have you forsaken me, right? And he's raising this point because he's saying Jesus is saying, my God, why, And, of course, being a Christian, I had the whole understanding that on the cross, Jesus was taking on the sins of mankind. And at the time, he wasn't, so he was kind of like, sort of like becoming, not that Jesus himself was sinful, but the sin of the human beings was put on him. But then I went back, looked into it a bit more, and found out that in uh I think it's Psalms 22. David speaking reiterates this phrase, and this phrase is sort of a prophecy of the Messiah. And then reading that passage alongside Matthew 27, where this was happening, it's like there's so much parallels in between what was happening in David's Psalms in Psalms 22 to what was actually happening to Jesus at that time. And knowing that this was a something that exists in manuscripts prior to Jesus coming, it was fascinating to see the coherence and the way the text was like connecting. And then starting to learn things about like how rabbis would teach through using the beginning phrases of like a sentence or a passage rather, right? They would sort of have these things as verbal, like memorization, like they would like just have these. It was a illiterate, largely illiterate culture, and so they had to have these verbal recitation of these long passages, and people memorize these long passages. And so a rabbi would just say the beginning of it, sort of like a song, like if you say so a part of a song lyric and then it loads the song into someone's mind. So it's kind of like Jesus was loading into the minds of the people, or at least the readers now, uh Psalms 22. And so it just became very fascinating. I started getting really into the word of God, and I started doing all this research, manuscripts, and all this type of stuff. And like I started understanding how history works, how what the criteria is for determining what is historically accurate and whatnot works. And I started just growing and developing. And then I found myself in a sort of like a deeper relationship with the God that I knew from a kid, from the experiences that I had. And I started experiencing not him in just the I don't know, like in just like an experiential sense, but an intellectual sense. My faith started making sense to me, not even just like making sense, but it made the most sense. Because then when you look into any other literature within antiquity, it becomes very clear that there is more evidence to support the claims of the Bible in many different sort of genres of evidence, if you will, even philosophy, even like, archaeology, even like, you know, um a lot of these other sort of fields of expertise, you start to figure out that there's more evidence for the biblical narrative than any other literature within history, like within antiquity, right? And so, I mean, at these times, it was a very different situation. Like writing was very different. The sort of things that they used to write on was very different. And they wrote on parchments and things like that. And they were like they were biodegradable materials. So it was very hard to keep the originals. And so, like, if you look into other people within history, you start to figure out that, like, a lot of the evidence that we have for historical figures is very late, compared to what we would understand right now, anyways. It's sometimes like 1,000 years, hundreds of years removed from the actual events that they're claiming to be from, because of course the originals would deteriorate and they would have to copy copies of copies of copies on other things, right? And so when you look at the scriptures, because of the impact of the scriptures, because of how epic a character Jesus was within history, there's just a lot more to go on. And so it was not even just that, like, there was evidence for the things that I believed already as a child, but there was nothing else that was more evident than the things that I believed as a child. And so throughout this sort of like grasping my fate from an intellectual perspective, I also started developing a personal relationship with God, like reading his word, and like I was spending a lot of time. I started becoming consumed with this, right? And now I'm seeing this all as God's work, like through him. This is the vehicle. These debates and these things were like the vehicle that he was using to bring me closer to him. And so as I was developing, like reading his word and understanding more about him and his character and the reality of his existence and who he really was and how he really was, I started falling more in love with him. I started developing my relationship with him. I started seeing his hand in my life in a lot of ways. He started doing things in my life where I'm seeing him showing up in a sense, right? And I've had my own personal experiences prior to, and this is one story that I should tell. I told stories about my family having demonic encounters, but one of the things that happened to me is, uh throughout maybe about 13 years old, I started developing what is known as sleep paralysis. And when I was a kid, I would feel this thing sort of come and try to come up my leg. And I know there's a name for it in Guyana, but it would start to, like, it feels like, and it would be the same sort of thing described in all those docu series and all those type of things. It's like the atmosphere shifts, and then you feel like a sort of like a heavy presence in the room. And then, there would be like really bad nights. There would be not so bad nights, but it started off as this thing sort of trying to come up my leg. And then, a kid, you would just shake your leg. You're like, and you would try to get rid of that thing. But um, as I got older and braver, I remember I was like 13 years old, and I was staying at like a family friend's house. At that time, we had a family friend put us up in his house. And uh, I was in the room, and there was people my whole family was in the room. There was one room in this whole place that we lived in, right? And we had two beds in the same room. My brother and I slept on one bed, and my mom and dad slept on the other bed. And I allowed this thing. I became so brave. I allowed this thing to come all the way up. Finally, when it got to like my neck one day, you know, it locked me off. And later off, and I mean, I tried to fight it. I tried to scream, couldn't get rid of it. And then when I prayed, it would go away, right? And then uh my later off in life, it became sort of like more tormenting. It was like very frequent and very often. I wasn't sleeping a lot at all. Like I would get tormented. I started sleeping on my couch in front of the TV. I would always have to have lights on in order to sleep, or like at least the TV on in order to sleep. And, you know, um, this one time, uh, well, actually, I learned about sleep paralysis, and the scientific understanding of it made sense to me. So what they say is your brain is sort of like still awake, but your body is falling asleep. And so, it's kind of like you're in a phase where your brain is sort of still alert and sort of awake-ish, but your body is falling asleep. So that's why it feels like you're gradually, and then after a certain point, when your whole body is asleep, it almost feels like there's a weight on you because your brain is awake, but it can't move. Your body can't move, or your body's not responding to signals from your brain telling it to move anymore. And so the more you start to like try to fight it, it's like you feel like it's tensioning on you. And that kind of made sense to me. That made sense to me, but it didn't make sense of the whole experience, right? Like, and so I kind of fought with this idea that maybe it's something just like a scientific, natural thing that happens or not, right? But this one night in particular, this thing came, and I just knew it was going to be a bad night, right? And it tormented me the whole night. And then it basically tormented me until the morning almost. And it was like already becoming day outside. And at one point, like it was attacking me. I was sleeping and I opened my eye and I saw a shadow leave from like my couch and flew onto my wall and then like kind of flew out the window. It was very quick. It was like it was gone, right? And when I seen that shadow, I was convinced. I was like, okay, this is a demon. You know what I'm saying? And I was like, okay, now my mind wasn't like, maybe, maybe not, or whatever, right? I was convinced this is a demon. And so I kind of waited for the presence to come back in the room. I was waiting there. I'm chilling and I'm like, come back. And then this time I'm cheese too, right? I'm like, okay, I know who you are, what you are. And so this thing comes back into the room. I felt the presence enter the room and I spoke to it. And I just told it, I'm like, yo, you're a coward, right? I'm like, yo, you come here every night, you disturb my sleep. And every time I mention the name of Jesus, you flee. And I'm like, you're a coward. Don't come back here. And from that day on, I've never had that type of experience with that specific thing again, right? Um, so that was also something that was very prevalent to me. Uh, at a certain point, my brother had gotten killed as well, and I remember being in this the night he got killed because I slept with the TV on. He was in Alberta. We were in Toronto. Alberta is about 6 hours flight, almost 3 days drive away from where we were at, right? And before he went there, my mom had some dreams and things like that. And those dreams were confirmed when the cops came to the house after we figured out that, like, maybe a week later, the cops came to the house and those dreams were confirmed. But she dreamt that there's these two officers taking him away, and they said that he stole something, and that's the reason they're taking him. And so my mom was fighting him, saying, "Yo, don't go," right? Before he even left for Alberta. And so she knew something was strange about this. the item that they said he stole that she saw in her dream was like a vice grip, like a blue vice grip or something. Don't quote me on that, but she actually she saw this in a dream, and then she went to the the flea market with my dad, and my dad was looking at this vice grip, and it was, now this is not a dream, this is she saw this vice grip in a dream, and then she was actually with my dad in real life at the flea market, and my dad's looking at this item that he wants to buy, and it's the same vice grip from her dream. And so she's shaking my dad. She's like, nah, don't buy this thing, right? And she pulls him away. She's not even trying to tell him why or anything like that, right? She pulls him away, and they're walking around, and I guess he kind of sneakily circles back around and he goes and buys this thing. And she's even more upset now about this, right? And this is making her even more nervous about my brother going to Alberta. So he's in Alberta, and he gets shot in a club in uh in sort of like, okay, so let me tell you what happened. Like at this point I didn't know he got shot or anything like that, right? But he got shot that night and killed in that club. But uh I'm sleeping. We're Remember, I'm far away. We don't know anything about that. And I remember waking up. I'm on my couch. I never watched the news because I didn't like the news, right? And so CP24 was on. CP24 is like a local news station in Toronto. And I remember being kind of freaked out at the fact that I was awake, because the way how I woke up, it was very sudden, right? It was very like I was from dead sleep to very alert. And I was only very alert for a short period of time. And in that short period of time on CP24, there was this news thing, and it went something like, there was a shooting in a downtown club called Red Light District or something like that uh in Alberta. Was it Alberta? What was the, I forget the exact name of the place that they were at, in Edmonton. And uh it was it said that two people were killed on the spot, and then that one person died shortly after reaching the hospital. They gave other details, like the fact that, seven people total were injured, I believe. It said something about one person being critical, which was the bouncer. And so, it just gave this short little clip, uh, three people killed in a downtown shooting in Alberta, sorry, in Edmonton, in the red light district, and two people killed on the spot. One person died shortly after reaching the hospital. And my sentiments was, yo, at least that one person that made it to the hospital had time to repent. And my concern was for the two people, right? Because in my brain I'm like, yo, maybe that, like, they had no time to make their heart right with God. A bullet probably, God forbid, this is one of my fears, is like, and this is one of the things the Bible talks about, being ready at all times, because you don't know when your end time is gonna come. And so, I always used to think about like a bullet flying through my brain at some point while I'm like living a certain sinful lifestyle, and just being caught in a moment where you don't have time to make your heart right with God. And so I remember having that thought. And then, it took a while for us to figure out that my brother actually died. Now, I forgot totally about this whole experience of having this dream. Not this dream. It wasn't even a dream. It was like actually me waking up, like from sleeping on this couch and seeing this, and then falling asleep, forgetting about it. And we found out it must have been the next day at some point in the night. We found out that my brother was killed in this shooting, right? Well, in a shooting in a club. Now, there was no other details given to us. And then the two officers that came, they came to us maybe about a week into this whole thing happening, or 2 weeks into this whole thing happening. There was obviously a huge investigation. They had to send the body from Alberta to Toronto. We hadn't seen him yet. We were still kind of hopeful that he would be alive, and that this is all kind of like, just like, it's not him, or like we'll find out something or whatever, right? But so we were still sort of in denial. But when these cops came, they came to confirm that it was him. And the cops that came were pretty much the cops that my mom saw in her dream, right? And she describes them as, she knows it's like a male and a female, and it's the same sort of, the same individuals that came. And so they were telling the story of what happened, and the way they recounted the story was the exact way that the news people recounted the story. They kind of gave us the spiel, there was a shooting in a downtown club named such and such. And when they got to the point of like how many people died, they said two people died on the spot. And they said, your son died shortly after reaching the hospital. And so even then, it didn't really click with me. The whole time I was mourning for my brother passing away, I was just asking God. I'm like, yo, God, please, like, like let me know if he made it or not. Like, cause in my brain, I'm thinking he's at a club. He's like, what I mean, drinking probably, like, this debauchery going on there. We don't, I'm thinking, man, my brother did not make it, even though I was still kind of wild myself. I'm like, I had this idea that this stuff is real, right? And so when it took me a while, actually, it was my pastor that confirmed, like, he listened to me tell this story, and he's like, yo, that's your confirmation that he made it. And it became like, and that this was about the time I was writing the eulogy, and it like just kind of like, it's like God brought everything back to me in a way where I'm like, yo, I get it. So God gave me the answer to the fact of my brother being have made it into heaven. The thing that I was asking him to comfort me on the whole time, he had given me the answer before I even knew my brother was dead. I hope this story makes sense. It's kind of a bit convoluted the way I'm telling it, but the reason I mentioned these two stories is these are sort of like, and I have many, many more stories. I can't share them all on the testimony, but these are like pivotal points in my life where I realized the truth of who God was. But coming back to where I was in the story here now, this was, and I'm 30 years old at this time when these debates started happening, right? And so I'm developing my relationship with God on an intellectual basis now, but now it's bridging a gap of like how real my God was, not just on not just on the experiential basis, but on, like the historical facts surrounding the person of Jesus Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, all of the hyperlinks in the text, the way how the text sort of like feng shui's between the Old and New Testament. I started seeing a lot of just mind blowing things from the scripture, and I started like getting very passionate about scripture, and my relationship with God started developing to the point where, he started, me and him started almost like, making, what, this is my story, I'm just gonna tell it. We made bargains. I made bargains with God, essentially. I'll give you an example. I went through and I did a deep dive into alcohol in the Bible, right? Because I'm drinking, right? So I wanted to know, is it okay, is it not okay? I figured out that from my research, and I still think this actually, that alcohol is not totally wrong, or neither is really anything really totally just in itself inherently evil, but uh it's the abuse or the use of alcohol that can become bad, and then other things along the lines, right? Like if you're spending too much time and spending too much of your resources, if this thing is becoming an idol in your life, if this is something that you're addicted to, if it's something that, you know, uh, you're dependent on, if it's something that, if you're getting drunk and like behaving like in a non-godly manner, it's causing you to do other things that are sinful, so I was still okay with doing it, but then I was also confronted with the fact that uh anything that is a stumbling block to your witness, right? So um if alcohol was a stumbling block to me being able to, witnessing for God, or if it became something that was a stumbling block to another brother, then I wouldn't be acting in love by exercising my freedom to partake in that specific thing, right? And so slowly, I ended up not, at this point, I wasn't smoking anymore because I didn't like cigarettes anyways, and I needed to quit. And then, so I ended up quitting throughout that. I ended up quitting weed because or marijuana because if I smoked marijuana, I would have wanted to smoke cigarettes. Or at that time, I used to smoke cigars. Actually, we call them Captain Blacks. They're like 30 times as deadly as a cigarette is, and so I had to quit all of that. And so alcohol, I was still drinking, and I was still doing, at that time, I was doing cocaine. So I was doing cocaine whenever I was drinking or really drinking or partying here and there. And so I'm drinking alcohol and doing cocaine and still reading the Bible and still like studying and still like listening to, at that time, believe it or not, I used to listen to like Ravi Zachariah. I used to listen to all these other preachers and debaters and things like that. And I was spending a lot of time consuming knowledge, but I was still working these things out. And so I made this bargain with God where I'm like, okay, God, if this becomes a stumbling block to me ministering, then I'll quit. Right. And I had this one incident where I was talking to a homie and I was talking about some information that I found out. At this time, I was talking about the Prophet Muhammad, or, you know, uh, who they consider a prophet, Muhammad. And I was talking about something that I figured out about surrounding his death. And so I'm talking to this homie. This homie is all the way, by the way. And this is the same homie that I originally started talking to like in front of his shop, and he's all the way in Mecca at the time. He's at the, like, the Kaaba essentially. He's out there. And so me and him are like shooting each other messages back and forth. And at this time, I hadn't drank like within like for like 2 and something days, but he specifically said, yo, if you've had any intoxicant within the last 72 hours, and sometimes this is the weird thing about sharing these testimonies, is that like a lot of the stuff is, in the scripture, it says, my sheep knows my voice and they hear me. And so me and my personal relationship with God, like I heard God's voice when he said that, like, cuz it was very specific. He said within 72 hours, if you had any intoxicant, then don't talk to me about nothing. And I started noticing that a lot of my friends were disrespecting me cuz I'm talking about God and these type of things, but I'm still living a life that was like, less than adequate. Well, right? And so it was very clear to me, like at that time, that God was speaking to me through these situations. And he was showing me that like this was becoming something that was going to hinder my walk with him, hinder my ability to be the, like, a person that people have a certain respect for, or that would listen to if I was preaching the gospel, or hinder my ability to minister to people. And so I quit. That day I decided to quit. That was 6 years ago. And I'm still free since then. I was able to, throughout my walk with God, like almost I get rid of almost every sinful inclination that I had. Let me preference this by saying that when you come from where I came from, it's like there's like junk in your house. And then when you go into your house, you look around and there's so much like garbage everywhere, that you get rid of the garbage, but then after you get rid of the garbage, then you find out that your floor is not actually totally clean, or there's some stuff on the windowsills, or there's some paint stuff, touch ups and whatnot that you need to do. And so you keep finding stuff. So it's not like I'm perfect now. I'm finding stuff, but I was effectively able to swerve a lot of the things that I had a girl at the time that I was living with that was also, like, that's an epic story by itself. Um, who I was sleeping with at the time, and I was starting to like delete and block girls from my profile, even girls that were my friends. I was starting to like, try. I didn't want to see people that would entice me into sinning or going on pornography sites. So I just totally got rid of all this stuff. I stopped watching pornography. I haven't watched pornography onto this day for over 6 years. Um, I mean, I would come across things and whatnot, and even that, I start to like try to send Facebook algorithm messages so that they know, you can click not interested or whatever to try to tailor your feed. So I was doing that, and uh, the girl that I was living with at the time, and we were sleeping together. Like, I was trying not to do this thing, but I didn't know how to tell her that I didn't want to do it, and it cumulated to the point where she noticed that I was like, very standoffish. And then she just asked me, and I just said, "Yo, this is sin." And I remember this one time, one of my homies took me to a church, and at this church, the minister started prophesying into my life. He told me stuff that is happening even onto now. And I remember he said this one phrase, and I don't think anybody else caught it, but I caught it, and I knew what God was speaking to me with. He said, "What hinderest thou?" Right? Very weird statement to say, like, randomly, but I knew what was hindering me. And that was like one of the things where I'm like, I know I'm sort of living in sin in this thing, and I need to get rid of this thing from my life. And I knew what it was. And then so, you know, by God's grace, I didn't know how to approach the conversation, but this girl approached the conversation with me, and like God opened the door. I was able to say what I wanted and what I thought about what we were doing. And, you know, boom, I ended up getting rid of that. And so like it was like now I was like fully entrenched into this Christian lifestyle. I started at the time, I really wanted to go to church, and I started visiting churches, but I also didn't want to go to what's my home church right now, because growing up in that church, I also like at this point I had already gained weight. I was bald. I was like, well, I am bald. And you know, like, but people there haven't seen me like that. I was also worried about what I was wearing. I didn't have a lot of money, so I'm like, man, I don't have clothes. Like, I don't want to go. Like, you know what I mean? I need to dress a certain way. I need to look spiffy or whatever. And I was also super broke. My van that I had at the time was all rusty and musty and crusty. And I didn't want to pull up with that thing. And I was so worried about like all these little things. And God had to strip that away from me to the point where I didn't care. I didn't care about none of that stuff. I just wanted to be in his presence. I just wanted to worship. I just wanted to like, and I started going to church, and, just spending time in his presence, and God started working out a lot of things. I ended up as a person who does renovations. Man, God started moving in my life. Like, I'm not encouraging anybody to think that following God is going to get you money or something like that, but doors started opening for me. Like, checks started coming in the mail. Like, I ended up losing my wallet at one point, and just to get back my IDs, I had to go update everything. I ended up getting my citizenship through that whole process. Like, I ended up getting hooked up with somebody who was doing this thing, and she helped me to put together a whole thing. And like, she you really walked me through. It's like, I can't explain how much God did for me. I would be here for hours if I was to tell you all the supernatural ways that God started working in my life and opening. But like, everything fixed up within like a year or two. Like, it became like, bruh, I went from being super broke to giving away money in the amounts that like people don't make a year. You know what I mean? And I mean, I'm years into my walk with God now, and I've seen different things and ups and downs and things like that. But uh like, man, just the grace of God, the love of God, the mercy of God, the way how God, like, transformed my life from where I came from to where I am now. It's just it's just like, I don't know, man. Like, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I just That's why I am the way I am. Is like I really do love him, like, a lot, for what he's done for me in my life, and for just who he is, and like how he is. And like, if anything, I want people to, and this is a part of what I'm doing now, sharing this testimony with you guys in this long form, and building these platforms to try to serve God in every way that I can, is, you know it's sort of a product of that relationship that I have with God, and my desire to sort of see people end up in the relationship with God, like that they were meant to have. Like, I believe that we're all created for one purpose. Well, you could say one purpose, sort of connected to know God and to make God known. And so, to be in relationship with God and to help people to find that relationship with God. And so, this is the overflow of what my life has become. Is just, I'm just a servant of the Most High God, and I'm just trying to see people and enter into that relationship with God as well. And that's why we're doing the things that we're doing now. We have street ministries, we have online ministries, we have, like, I minister in my day to day life. Yesterday, for instance, I went to a job site. There was a new worker on that job site, Mexican dude, and he was telling me that he was going to become a pastor, and that he's not a believer in God anymore at one point. And he told me about something that a pastor said to him that really threw him off. And then, I was able to spend a little time and talk to him about the fact of how inadequate we are, as how inadequate men are, and the reason why we needed Jesus to save us. You know what I mean? That's the whole angle of the Bible. And God used me in that situation, and I believe that that guy is probably now a believer in God again, based on that conversation. And these are things that this is yesterday I'm telling you guys about. Like, today is Saturday, and let me see if I can tell you. Saturday, January 11th, 2025. So that was January 10th, you know? Uh and so you guys are going to be seeing this tomorrow, essentially. But God has been using me this entire time to speak to people. And this is something that I'll say, is that, like, I don't believe that, you know, God purposes for us to go through a lot of these things, not in general, anyways. I believe that a lot of times, a lot of the things that we do and we get into is a product of our own disobedience to what God is telling us to do. So, meaning that God told us not to do the things that we did, that got us into the situations we got into. So, we can't blame Him and say that, oh, God purpose for me to do this stuff. But I do believe that at the point you surrender your life to God, He's able to use everything that happened in your life, and repurpose it and use it for His kingdom and for His glory. And every sort of skill or bit of knowledge that you gain throughout your life, whether you feel like you're walking away from God and whatnot, when you surrender your life to God, God is able to use that and repurpose it. And that's what's happening in my life. Is a lot of the spaces that I've been able to occupy and speak to, and a lot of the people that I've been able to influence in my life, around me in my immediate circle, and just even strangers that I run into ever so often, and through acts of kindness and generosity and things like that. it's just amazing what God is doing. And that's my encouragement. I hope you guys enjoy, sort of like, enjoyed my testimony. I've kind of opened up a bit and try to let you into my space a bit and let you into sort of my personal life in a lot of ways. I was actually really nervous throughout doing this. Halfway through, I'm like, whoa, should I be sharing? And some of the stuff that I could have said, even I was nervous about sharing, but I'm like, you know what? It's my testimony. I'm just gonna share it. And at the very least, I hope it was like at least interesting to you guys. But I, it, I hope that it's also something that will act as sort of a light, if you will, that will draw you to God. Like, I hope that it would act as a thing, a story that you could look to and say, man, I want to get to know that Jesus as well. I want to have, this relationship with God as well. Or I see, the reality of what the things that, uh God is, the reality of God through this story. You know what I mean? And who he is and how he is. But yeah, that's my story. And you know, I'm just gonna. I just pray that you know you guys would have that experience with God as well. And for some of you who have walked away from faith, maybe you guys were Christians or grew up in a Christian household, and maybe you had uh your own doubts and thoughts and whatnot. I pray that, like, God shows up for you in a major way, and I pray that you guys would just open your eyes to see. Sometimes I don't think that it wasn't that God wasn't with me for the whole years that I was being debaucherous. I just think that I wasn't able to see him. I wasn't able to see what he was, where he was, or what he was doing, or how he was guiding me. And a lot of times I was probably even ignoring what he was trying to tell me because I had my own agenda and my own passions and lusts and things that I wanted to fulfill. And so I was thinking about it in a different way. So my prayer is that you guys would be able to see that as well. And just in closing, I wanted to say that the thing that plagued me throughout my past life, even though I would say that I still believed in Jesus, is that I made excuses. I made my faith become a thing that was used to live a lifestyle of sin. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I looked at people as imperfect. I looked at the scriptures and saw that all these characters were imperfect. And I looked at these lust and these desires as a natural man thing that we were doing. And then I justified it under the guise of, like, well, that's why Jesus needed to come and die for our sins, because we couldn't be perfect. We couldn't. And so that is true, but I used it to live in sin. I used it to say, okay, well, God knows I can't be perfect. And so, my prayer for you guys is that you would come into an intimate and deep relationship with God in a way that your love for him will cause you to, sort of like uh desire to be obedient to him, desire to live a lifestyle that's indicative of a Christian, a professing Christian, and a person who is connected with the Holy Spirit. And that's it. Thank you.